A couple months ago, I came home from a 3-week consulting trip expecting nothing more exciting than mowing my lawn and sleeping in my own bed, but instead I found a 24-foot fishing boat sitting across my driveway like somebody had forgotten who actually owned the place. And believe it or not, that trailer ended up becoming the most expensive parking space anywhere on my street. Looking back now, the money wasn't even the part that stayed with me. It was realizing how quickly some people convince themselves that if you aren't around to defend what's yours, then maybe it isn't really yours anymore. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for almost 12 years I've worked as a business consultant, the kind of job that has me bouncing between manufacturing plants, logistics companies, and family-owned businesses all over the Midwest. Some months I'm home every night. Other months I'm living out of airport lounges and hotel rooms, chasing delayed flights and eating dinners out of paper bags. My neighbors all knew that about me. They'd wave whenever they saw me loading another suitcase into my truck, and I'd usually joke that my mailbox probably knew me better than I knew my own couch. I never imagined that my travel schedule would slowly become an invitation. I live just outside Franklin, Indiana, in a quiet subdivision where everyone likes to think they're friendly. We wave. We bring each other cookies at Christmas. We complain about the weather together. At least that's what it looks like from the outside. Right next door lived a guy named Curtis Langley. Curtis loved two things more than anything else in the world: his fishing boat and letting everyone know he owned one. Every Friday afternoon, if the weather looked halfway decent, he'd polish that boat until it looked like it belonged in a showroom instead of a neighborhood driveway. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. We'd exchanged small talk over the fence a handful of times, talked about football once, borrowed each other's trash cans during a windy week. Nothing memorable. At least that's what I thought. The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my street that afternoon wasn't even the trailer. It was how strangely comfortable it looked sitting on my concrete, almost like it had been there long enough to belong. My own driveway stretched almost 60 feet from the street to my garage, wide enough for guests whenever family visited. Curtis had backed his trailer almost perfectly down the middle, leaving just enough room to make it obvious he hadn't accidentally crossed the property line. This was deliberate. I parked along the curb, stepped out, looked at the trailer for a few seconds, then walked straight to his front door. He answered holding a glass of iced tea, looked at me for maybe 2 seconds, smiled like he was surprised I'd returned so soon, and before I could even ask the question, he shrugged. "Oh, you're back already." I pointed toward my driveway. "Mind moving your trailer?" He glanced over my shoulder without a hint of embarrassment. "You've been gone for weeks. I figured you weren't using it." I laughed because I honestly thought he was kidding. "Well, I'm using it now." Instead of apologizing, he leaned against the doorframe and said something I'll probably never forget. "Seems kind of selfish to let all that empty concrete go to waste." I remember staring at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "Curtis," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "that's my property." He shrugged again. "Didn't seem like you minded." Then he turned around, walked back into his house, and quietly closed the door while I was still standing on his porch. That was the exact moment everything changed. If he'd apologized, moved the trailer, maybe even admitted he'd made a bad decision, this story would have ended right there. But disrespect has a funny way of growing roots once somebody thinks they'll never face consequences. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about his confidence bothered me more than the trailer itself. It wasn't just that he'd parked there. It was the way he'd acted like I was inconveniencing him by asking for my own driveway back. Around midnight, I poured myself another cup of coffee, opened the security camera app on my laptop, and started scrolling backward through old recordings. At first, I only wanted to know how many times he'd done it. 10 minutes later, I realized I was asking the wrong question. The real question was, how long had this been happening? Week after week, video after video, there it was. His truck pulling in. The trailer backing onto my driveway. Sometimes he'd leave it overnight. Sometimes it sat there for days while I was out of state. I kept scrolling. October, September, August, then July. The pattern never changed. One Saturday, recording showed 3 of his buddies standing on my driveway loading coolers, tackle boxes, folding chairs, and enough fishing gear to stock a marina while laughing and drinking beer like they were gathering on land they owned. Another clip showed his teenage son washing the trailer with a garden hose while standing entirely on my property. They weren't hiding it. They'd become comfortable enough to stop looking over their shoulders. By the time the sun started coming up, I'd filled an entire folder with saved video clips, each one timestamped, each one telling the same story from a different day. I leaned back in my chair and realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and disappears fast. This felt different. This felt patient, calculated, quiet. Curtis thought my absence meant I wasn't paying attention, but he had confused silence with surrender, and those are two very different things. The next morning, instead of calling another neighbor or arguing across the fence, I called a real estate attorney whose number had been sitting in my contacts for years after helping me close on the house. I told her everything, and after listening for less than 5 minutes, she simply said, "Ethan, before we decide what to do, let's first find out exactly how expensive your neighbor's free parking has really been." To be continued in part 2. The attorney called me back later that afternoon after pulling the original deed, the county survey, and every document attached to my property since the subdivision was built, and before she even started explaining the legal side of it, she laughed quietly and said, "Well, your neighbor picked the wrong driveway. Every inch of that concrete belonged exclusively to me. There wasn't a shared easement, no utility agreement, no neighborhood access clause, nothing that even remotely gave Curtis the right to leave his trailer there." Then she asked me a question I hadn't considered. "Did he benefit from using your property?" I answered without thinking. "Of course he did. His own driveway barely fits his pickup." She paused. "Then stop thinking about this as a disagreement between neighbors. Start thinking about it as someone using an asset that belongs to you without permission." It sounds strange now, but hearing it described that way completely changed my mindset. I wasn't trying to punish him anymore. I was protecting something I'd spent years paying for. Over the next 2 days, I organized every camera clip into dated folders, made screenshots of license plates, printed still photos showing the trailer sitting entirely inside my property line, and even marked each appearance on a calendar. 11 months, 47 separate occasions, hundreds of hours of unauthorized use. When I spread everything across my dining room table, it looked less like a neighborhood annoyance and more like evidence prepared for trial. My attorney reviewed everything, nodded once, then suggested something I never would have thought of myself. Give him a choice. Judges like reasonable people. I like that advice. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't revenge. It was simply fair. That weekend, I hired a local contractor to install a heavy steel security bollard at the entrance to my driveway. It wasn't some cheap removable post from a hardware store. This thing disappeared nearly 4 feet into reinforced concrete with a locking steel core that would stop a truck if someone tried forcing their way through. While the concrete cured, a couple neighbors wandered over pretending they were just out for a walk. Mrs. Ramirez from across the street tilted her head and smiled. "Finally got tired of the boat." I looked at her. "You noticed?" She laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. "Honey, everyone noticed." That sentence caught me completely off guard. "Everyone." She nodded toward the end of the street. "Curtis has been telling people you didn't mind because you were hardly ever home." About an hour later, another neighbor, Ben, stopped by while walking his dog. Without me asking a single question, he said, "I've watched him back that trailer into your driveway for months. Thought maybe you two had some arrangement." Then came the biggest surprise. Linda, who lived diagonally across from us, told me she'd seen Curtis hosting fishing trips from my driveway several weekends in a row while I was traveling. His friends parked along the curb, loaded coolers onto the boat, joked around. Honestly, it looked like they believed the place belonged to him. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about convenience anymore. Curtis had quietly rewritten the story for the entire neighborhood. He wasn't borrowing my property. In his version, he'd been given permission. The problem with lies like that is they survive only until the truth shows up carrying paperwork. 3 days later, my attorney mailed Curtis a certified letter. It was polite, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. It included copies of the survey, photographs, references to state property law, and 2 options. Option 1 was simple. Remove the trailer permanently, never use my driveway again, and we'd consider the matter closed after discussing reasonable compensation for the past unauthorized use. Option 2 offered him something far more generous than he deserved. We would treat the driveway as leased parking space beginning immediately for $195 a month, along with reimbursement totaling $2,145 for the previous 11 months of documented use. In return, He could legally continue storing the trailer there under written conditions. Personally, I expected him to reject both options and start yelling. Instead, he waited exactly 1 day before pounding on my front door. The second I opened it, he waved the letter in the air like it had personally insulted him. "Are you serious?" he barked. "You're charging me rent for concrete." I leaned against the doorway. "No, I'm charging you for my concrete." He shook his head. "Nobody does this to neighbors. Nobody parks on someone else's property for almost a year either." His face turned bright red. "You never complained." I couldn't help smiling. "Curtis, not knowing something is happening isn't the same as approving it." He stood there for another few seconds expecting me to argue. Instead, I simply waited. Silence can be incredibly uncomfortable when you're the one running out of excuses. Finally, he muttered, "This is ridiculous," and stormed back across the lawn. Over the next week, he tried every strategy except accepting responsibility. One afternoon, he caught me checking the mailbox. "You know," he said casually, "lawyers are expensive. We could forget all this." "We still can," I answered. "Move the trailer." He frowned. "Where am I supposed to put it?" I shrugged. "That's a question you should have asked yourself 11 months ago." Another evening, he tried guilt instead of anger. "We've been neighbors for years." "Exactly," I replied. "That's why this is disappointing." He even suggested we split the driveway somehow, as though repeatedly ignoring a property line magically created new ownership rights. Every conversation ended the same way. I stayed calm. He became louder. The neighborhood started noticing. People slowed down while driving past. Curtains moved. Garage doors stayed open a little longer than usual. Everyone sensed something was unfolding, but almost nobody knew the full story. Then Curtis made the mistake that ended any chance of him controlling the narrative. At a weekend barbecue hosted 2 houses down, he started telling people I was trying to extort him over a few harmless parking jobs. Unfortunately for him, 3 neighbors who had watched everything for nearly a year happened to be standing within earshot. Ben interrupted first. "Harmless? You practically lived on Ethan's driveway." Linda added, "Didn't you tell everyone he said it was okay?" Curtis froze. Mrs. Ramirez folded her arms and quietly said, "Funny, because Ethan was in Chicago most of that time." The conversation died instantly. You could almost hear the gears turning inside everyone's head as his own version of events unraveled one sentence at a time. Nobody yelled. Nobody argued. They simply looked at him differently, and sometimes disappointment from people you know hurts more than losing an argument. A few days later, he knocked again, but this time there wasn't any anger in his posture. He looked exhausted, like someone who had finally realized the ground beneath him had disappeared. "Can we talk?" he asked. I invited him onto the porch. He stared at the driveway for several seconds before speaking. I shouldn't have assumed it was okay. That was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard. Then he asked if we could reduce the back payment. I shook my head. "The number isn't emotional. It's documented." He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and quietly admitted his own driveway renovation had never been finished because he kept putting it off, and my empty driveway had become the easy solution until eventually it stopped feeling temporary. That explanation actually made sense, but understanding why someone crossed a line doesn't erase the fact that they crossed it. We sat there another minute without speaking, both looking at the trailer that had somehow managed to become the center of an entire neighborhood conversation. And finally, Curtis asked one last question that told me he already knew how this was going to end. "If I sign, is this over?" I looked him straight in the eye before answering. "That depends entirely on what you do after you sign." Curtis came back the following afternoon carrying a plain manila folder instead of the attitude he'd been wearing for the past 2 months. And before either of us said a word, he reached inside, pulled out the signed agreement, then slid a cashier's check across the small table on my front porch. $2,145, he said quietly. "Every penny." I picked up the check, looked it over, then signed my portion of the lease without celebrating because, honestly, there wasn't anything to celebrate. I'd rather have had an honest neighbor than a paid tenant. But life doesn't always give you that choice. Sometimes all you can do is make sure people understand your boundaries the only language they'll actually respect. Once the paperwork was finished, I handed him a copy and pointed toward the steel bollards standing at the entrance to my driveway. "One more thing," I said. "Read page 4 again when you get home." He flipped through the pages, found the section, and frowned almost immediately. Seriously? I nodded. Very seriously. The clause was simple. If a monthly payment was missed by even one day, the lease automatically suspended. The bollard stayed locked. A towing company I already had under contract would remove the trailer within 24 hours if it remained on my property, and every towing charge, storage fee, and administrative cost belonged entirely to him. Curtis looked up. That's a little excessive, don't you think? I smiled politely. Not compared to assuming someone else's property belonged to you for almost a year. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood became strangely quiet again. No more whispered conversations. No more curious people slowing down in front of our houses. Every first Monday of the month, an envelope appeared in my mailbox containing $195. Always on time. Always the exact amount. Almost like Curtis had developed a brand new appreciation for calendars. A month later, he knocked on my door again, and for a split second I wondered if we were about to repeat the entire cycle. Instead, he stood there awkwardly holding a folded copy of the agreement. Would you consider taking out that towing clause now that you've got your money? I shook my head before he even finished. No. He looked disappointed, but not surprised. I figured you'd say that. About 3 months later, he asked again, this time saying, I've proven I pay on time. I answered the same way. The clause isn't there because I expect you to miss a payment. It's there because once trust is broken, paperwork has to do the job trust used to do. He stared at me for a second, then gave a slow nod that almost felt like acceptance. After that, he never brought it up again. Funny enough, our relationship slowly became civil. Not friendly, not close, but respectful in a way it had never been before. We'd wave across the yard. Sometimes we'd talk about the weather or complain about rising property taxes. And every now and then I'd catch him looking at that steel bollard before backing his trailer into the rented space with almost perfect precision, making absolutely sure he stayed inside every line. It occurred to me one afternoon that the bollard wasn't really protecting my driveway anymore. It was protecting a boundary that should have existed from the very beginning. Looking back, the biggest lesson had nothing to do with lawyers, contracts, or even money. It was about how easily people rewrite reality when nobody challenges them. Curtis had convinced himself that an empty driveway meant available, then convinced the neighborhood I'd approved it, and after repeating that story enough times, I honestly think he started believing it himself. That's the dangerous thing about entitlement. It rarely arrives wearing a villain's face. Most of the time it shows up disguised as convenience, slowly borrowing a little more today than it borrowed yesterday, until eventually someone forgets where the property line was in the first place. I also learned something about myself. Years ago, I probably would have swallowed my frustration just to keep the peace, because that's what a lot of us are taught to do. Don't make waves. Don't upset the neighbors. Be the bigger person. But being the bigger person doesn't mean becoming the easier target. Boundaries aren't acts of aggression. They're acts of self-respect. Every single payment Curtis makes now reminds me that protecting what you've worked for isn't selfish, it's necessary. So yes, that little stretch of concrete eventually became the most expensive parking space on our block, not because I wanted revenge, but because actions have value. And sometimes the only way people understand that value is when it finally appears on an invoice. Now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by charging him for the months he'd already used my driveway? Or was that the only fair outcome after nearly a year of unauthorized parking and excuse after excuse? Have you ever had a neighbor slowly cross a line until you finally had enough? And if you were in my shoes, would you have handled it differently or exactly the same? Share your story and your opinion down in the comments, because these neighborhood disputes always seem simple from the outside, until you're the one standing in your own driveway wondering when somebody else decided it belonged to them.